3 months after 2 atomic bombs fell on Japan, American soldiers carried a set of large machines out of a damaged laboratory in Tokyo, broke them apart, and dumped the pieces into Tokyo Bay. The machines were cyclotrons, particle accelerators, among the most advanced scientific instruments the country possessed, and they had belonged to a small group of Japanese physicists who, during the war, had been asked a question that sounds almost impossible to believe now. They had been asked whether Japan could build an atomic bomb of its own. This is the part of the story that almost no one tells. The nation that the world remembers as the victim of the atomic age, the country of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the one place on Earth where such a weapon was ever used against people, had during those same years run its own quiet program to construct the very same thing. It never came close, but it existed. And when the war ended, the winners did not just defeat that effort, they erased the machines behind it, in an act that troubled some of their own scientists, even as it happened.
To understand how Japan came to be reaching for an atomic weapon, you have to start with a single man and a single building. The man was Yoshio Nishina, the most important physicist in Japan, who had studied in Europe alongside the founders of the new atomic physics and brought that knowledge home. The building was the RIKEN, the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research in Tokyo, a respected center of pure science that by the late 1930s housed some of the finest research equipment in Asia. Nishina was not a weapons designer. He was a scientist of the first rank, fascinated by the structure of the atom for its own sake. And the RIKEN, under his direction, was a place of genuine discovery. But the discovery of nuclear fission in Europe at the end of the 1930s changed what laboratories like his could be asked to do. Word reached the militaries of every major power that the atom might be turned into a weapon of unimaginable force. And in Japan, as in the United States and Germany, men in uniform began to wonder whether their own physicists could deliver it. They went to Nishina, they went to the RIKEN, and a project was born.
The project the Army gave to Nishina was called NIGO. It was a modest, almost cautious undertaking, nothing like the vast industrial machine the United States was assembling in secret on the other side of the world. A small team of researchers at the RIKEN set out to study whether a bomb was possible at all, and if it was, how the necessary material might be obtained. From the very beginning, the difficulty was not the physics, but the substance the physics required. An atomic bomb needs uranium of a particular kind, a rare form of the metal that makes up only a tiny fraction of what is mined, and which must be painstakingly separated from the rest. Japan had almost no uranium to begin with, and no industrial means of separating the rare form from the common on any meaningful scale. The scientists understood the theory. They could see, on paper, the shape of the weapon. What they did not have was the one thing that turns theory into a bomb: the material itself, in quantity, refined to a purity that lay far beyond the reach of a country already.
And the Army's project was not the only one. The Japanese Navy, distrustful of the Army and wary of depending on it for anything, started a separate atomic effort of its own. This second program was called EFGO, and it was centered not in Tokyo, but in Kyoto, under another distinguished physicist, Bunsaku Arakatsu. So Japan, a nation that could not spare the steel to finish its warships or the fuel to fly its aircraft, was now running 2 competing atomic research programs at once: the Army's NIGO at the RIKEN and the Navy's EFGO in Kyoto, divided by the same rivalry that had hampered the Japanese war effort from the start. Neither program had the resources to succeed. Neither was given the urgency, the money, or the raw materials that such an effort truly demanded. They were small, scattered, and starved, pursued by brilliant men working with almost nothing. To call them a race for the bomb would be to flatter them, but they were real, and they were aimed, however faintly,
at the same terrible goal that was being pursued with overwhelming force an ocean away.
The heart of the problem was uranium. And to understand why Japan could never solve it, you have to understand what the scientists were actually trying to do. Natural uranium is overwhelmingly made of one form of the metal that will not sustain an explosive chain reaction. Hidden within it, in tiny amounts, is a second form, chemically identical, but capable of the runaway fission that makes a bomb. The two are so nearly the same that no ordinary chemistry can tell them apart. They can only be separated by exploiting the almost imperceptible difference in their weight, a process so delicate and so demanding that it consumed the largest share of the entire American bomb effort, requiring enormous factories and quantities of electricity that a single one of them could draw as much power as a city. This was the wall that stood in front of Nishina and his team. Not a question of whether they understood the science, they did, but whether a war-strangled island nation could ever build the colossal industrial apparatus that separating uranium required. The answer, though no one would say it out loud, was already no. The method the Recon team pursued was thermal diffusion, an attempt to coax the two forms of uranium apart by heat, driving the lighter one to drift slightly away from the heavier within a tall, heated column. It was an ingenious approach for a laboratory with little to work with, and Nishina's researchers built an apparatus to try it. But thermal diffusion on a laboratory scale is one thing. Producing bomb-grade material is another entirely. A task that would have demanded the method be multiplied thousands of times over in a great industrial plant. The team struggled even to obtain the uranium compounds they needed to feed the experiment. Supplies that had been expected from occupied territories failed to arrive. Equipment was improvised. And all the while, the war was closing in around them, draining away the materials, the manpower, and the time that any real progress would have required. What the scientists were doing was honest and serious work, but it was the work of a few men in a few rooms, attempting by hand and ingenuity what the enemy was accomplishing with the full industrial might of a continent. At the center of the Recon's capability stood its cyclotrons. A cyclotron is a particle accelerator, a great circular electromagnet that whirls charged particles to high speed and hurls them at targets, a tool for probing the atom and creating the rare substances of nuclear research. The Recon possessed two of them, including one of the largest outside the United States, and they were the pride of Japanese physics, machines that placed the institute among the leading research centers of the world. They were not in themselves instruments for making a bomb. They were tools of fundamental science, used to study the nucleus and to produce materials for medical and biological research as much as anything else. But in the strained logic of wartime, and in the suspicions that would follow defeat, the line between a research accelerator and a weapons program was easy to blur. The cyclotrons were the most visible symbol of Japan's nuclear knowledge, the clearest physical proof that this was a country with real Japan physicists and real Japan machines. And that symbolism, more than anything they actually did, would seal their fate.
Then the war itself fell upon the laboratory. As American bombers ranged over Tokyo, burning vast stretches of the city, the Recon did not escape. In the spring of 1945, the Institute was struck, and the apparatus that Nishina's team had built to separate uranium was damaged in the bombing. The fragile thread of the experiment, already barely holding, was effectively severed. Whatever slim chance the project might have had, and it was always vanishingly slim, was now gone. The scientists were left amid the wreckage of their own work, in a city being reduced to ash, and a country whose defeat was no longer in doubt. The Army's atomic project, never more than a hopeful study, quietly came apart. The Navy's effort in Kyoto fared no better. By the time the bombs that the Japanese physicists had only dreamed of fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the men of the Recon understood, with a terrible and intimate clarity,
that perhaps no one else in Japan could share. Exactly what had been done to their country, and exactly how far they themselves had been from ever doing it first.
There is a particular and painful irony in the fact that it was Yoshio Nishina, of all people in Japan, who was asked to confirm what had happened at Hiroshima. When the first bomb fell in August of 1945, the Japanese authorities did not at first know what kind of weapon had been used. They knew only that a single explosion had destroyed an entire city. And so they turned to the one man whose expertise was beyond question, the physicist who had spent the war studying the very weapon they now suspected had been used against them. Nishina was sent to examine the ruins. Walking through the devastation, the scientist who had been asked whether Japan could build an atomic bomb now stood in the proof that someone else had built one. He confirmed what the evidence told him, that this had been a nuclear weapon, the thing he understood better than almost anyone in the country, the thing his own project had been unable to produce. Few men in history have been placed in so cruel a position, to be the nation's authority on a weapon, and to have that authority confirmed by walking through the ashes of his own people.
It is worth being honest and precise about how far apart the two efforts truly were, because the temptation to dramatize is strong, and the truth is more sobering. The American program was one of the largest industrial undertakings in human history, employing well over 100,000 people, consuming enormous sums of money, building entire secret cities to house the work, and harnessing a share of a continent's electrical power to separate uranium and produce plutonium. The Japanese program, by comparison, was a handful of scientists, a few rooms, a damaged apparatus, and a chronic, crippling shortage of the one material on which everything depended. The gap between them was not a matter of months or of some missing breakthrough. It was the difference between a nation that had bet its full industrial existence on the weapon and a nation that could barely feed the experiment a few grams of the substance it needed. Japan was not a step behind in a race. It was, in any realistic sense, never in the race at all. To suggest otherwise would be to misunderstand the scale of what an atomic bomb actually required, and to flatter an effort that history should remember honestly, not luridly.
And yet, the existence of the program, however small, carries a weight that has nothing to do with how close it came. Because the meaning of the Japanese atomic effort is not military, it is moral. Here was a nation that would, within a single generation, become the great symbol of the world's nuclear conscience. The country whose two ruined cities stand in the memory of humanity as the warning of what these weapons do. And that same nation had, in the years just before, been asking its own finest minds to build the weapon that would later be used against it. Both things are true at once. The victim and the would-be wielder were the same country, separated only by the brute fact of which side had the uranium and the factories and the time. This is not an accusation. Almost every major power of the age was reaching for the bomb. The question was never the desire, but the capacity. What it means is something more unsettling than guilt. It means that the line between the nation that drops the weapon and the nation it falls upon can be as thin as a few years, and a question of industrial scale.
When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the atomic project simply stopped. There was nothing left to stop, in truth. NIGO had effectively ended with the bombing of the Riken, and FGO and Kyoto had never advanced far enough to matter. The scientists put away their work. The few records that survived the bombing and the chaos of defeat were gathered or scattered. And the men who had spent the war on the impossible task of building a Japanese bomb turned, like everyone else in the ruined country, to the immediate problem of survival in a defeated and occupied land. They might reasonably have expected that their failed, half-starved project would be left to fade quietly into history, an unsuccessful footnote to a lost war, of interest to almost no one. But the occupying power had not finished with the Riken. The Americans who now governed Japan were about to turn their attention to the Institute's most prized possessions, the cyclotrons, in an episode that would become one of the strangest and most contested acts of the entire occupation.
In November of 1945, 3 months after the surrender, American occupation authorities ordered the destruction of the cyclotrons at the Riken. The machines, including the great accelerator that had been the centerpiece of Japanese physics, were broken apart by the occupying forces, and the wreckage was loaded up, carried out, and dumped into Tokyo Bay. The pride of a nation's science, the most advanced research instruments it possessed, were reduced to scrap and sunk in the harbor. The stated reasoning was the prevention of any Japanese atomic weapons research. The cyclotrons were treated as part of the war-making apparatus that the occupation was charged with dismantling, no different in principle from a battleship or a munitions plant. To the officers who carried out the order, the logic may have seemed straightforward. This was a defeated enemy that had run an atomic program, and these were the machines at the heart of it. But that logic rested on a confusion, and the confusion would not go unnoticed.
The confusion was this. A cyclotron is not a bomb-making machine. It is an instrument of pure research, used to study the atom, to advance physics, to produce isotopes for medicine and biology. It cannot, by itself, manufacture a usable atomic weapon, any more than a telescope can fire a shell. The world's physicists understood this perfectly well, and the destruction of the Riken cyclotrons was not the quiet, uncontroversial act the Order may have imagined it to be. In the United States itself, among the very scientific community that had built the atomic bomb, the news provoked dismay and protest. American physicists recognized the machines for what they were, tools of legitimate, peaceful science, and saw their destruction not as a security measure, but as an act of vandalism against research, a needless wound inflicted on the knowledge of the world. The decision was condemned as a blunder, an overreach. Why then did it happen? The answer lies in the fearful and confused atmosphere of the months just after the war, when the full meaning of the atomic age was only beginning to be understood, and the impulse to control this terrifying new knowledge ran far ahead of any clear thinking about how. The order to destroy the cyclotrons appears to have been the product of haste and misunderstanding, rather than considered policy, a directive issued and carried out before cooler and better-informed judgment could intervene, and quickly regretted by some of those associated with it once the protests came. It was an act born of the same dread that hung over the whole post-war world, the dread of the weapon that had just been unleashed, and the desperate wish to make sure no one else could ever build it. In that fear, the distinction between a research machine and a weapons program was lost. The Americans destroyed the cyclotrons, not because the machines were dangerous, but because they could not, in that anxious moment, be quite sure they were not. And so the instruments went into the bay.
There is a deeper meaning in what was sunk in Tokyo Bay that November, beyond the loss of a few extraordinary machines. The destruction of the cyclotrons did something to the memory of the Japanese atomic program itself. The most visible, most tangible evidence of Japan's wartime nuclear effort, the very objects that proved this had been a country with real atomic physicists and real atomic machines, were carried off and drowned. What remained was paper, scattered and incomplete, and the recollections of a few scientists. The story grew faint and easy to forget, and so a strange thing happened to history. The nation that became the symbol of the nuclear victim was the same nation whose own atomic effort had been physically erased by the victor, its machines sunk out of sight in the harbor of its own capital. The evidence that Japan too had reached for the bomb did not vanish on its own. There is something singular about a chapter of history that survives mostly as an absence. The Japanese atomic program left almost nothing behind that a person can go and see. There is no preserved laboratory, no surviving great machine, no monument. The cyclotrons are at the bottom of Tokyo Bay. The apparatus burned in the bombing. The buildings rebuilt or replaced. What remains is a thin scattering of documents and a handful of names. Nishina, Arakatsu, Nigo, Efko, and the difficult, easily forgotten fact that they point to. And yet, the very faintness of the trail is part of what makes the story matter. It is a reminder that history is not only what happened, but what was kept and what was erased. That the record we inherit has been shaped, sometimes deliberately, by the hands of the victors. The Japanese bomb that was never built, and the machines that were sunk so that no one could mistake their purpose, together form one of the war's quietest and most revealing episodes. A story preserved almost in... The cyclotrons in the bay are the part of the story that refuses to settle into a simple lesson. They were not weapons, and destroying them prevented no bomb, because there was no bomb, and no near bomb to prevent. They were instruments of science, sunk by men who feared what they did not fully understand, in a moment when the whole world was learning to be afraid of the atom. Their destruction was condemned at the time by the scientists best placed to judge it, and it has been remembered since as a mistake, an act of fear rather than reason. But it was also, in its way, an honest expression of the age it belonged to. The bomb had just shown the world what physics could do, and the first instinct of the victors was to reach for the nearest atomic thing they could find and put it beyond use. That the nearest thing was a research machine and not a weapon is the tragedy and the irony of it. The cyclotrons were casualties not of the war, but of the dread that the war's ending had let loose upon the world.
And there is a final meaning in this story, one that is easy to miss because it asks us to hold two opposite ideas at once. Japan is, rightly and forever, the nation that suffered the atomic bomb, the one country that knows from its own flesh what these weapons do, and that has carried that knowledge into the world as a warning. None of what we have described diminishes that truth by a single degree. But alongside it sits the quieter fact that the same nation had been reaching, faintly and without success, for the same weapon, and that the proof of it was sunk in a harbor by the people who had used the weapon first. History is rarely as clean as memory would prefer. The victim and the would-be maker, the warning and the ambition, the ashes of Hiroshima and the cyclotrons in Tokyo Bay, all of them belong to the same country and the same handful of years. To remember only one half is to misremember the whole. The full story is harder and stranger and truer. A nation that reached for the bomb, was struck by it, and then watched the winners erase the evidence that it had ever reached at all.
The machines went into the bay. The program faded from memory, and the occupied nation turned to the work of simply surviving. But the deepest wound of Japan's post-war years was not the loss of a few research instruments, nor even the shame of a defeated science. It was human, and it was vast. Scattered across the whole of Asia, in China, in Manchuria, in the islands of the Pacific, in the territories the empire had conquered and then lost, were more than 6.5 million Japanese, soldiers and settlers and civilians, suddenly stranded in hostile lands with no way home. The war was over, but their ordeal was only beginning. A desperate, years-long effort to carry millions of people back across the sea to a homeland that lay in ruins and could barely feed the ones already there. It was one of the largest movements of human beings in modern history, and it has been almost entirely forgotten outside Japan. Next on Tora Files, the story of the Great Repatriation, the millions who had to find their way back to a country that no longer had room for them. Tora Files tells the untold history of the Pacific War from the Japanese side, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.